Hi, good evening. I'm your moderator this evening, Andrew Sharp from Nikkei Asia. For the past decade, anytime I've been tasked with writing a story about Japan-Russia relations, my go-to person to put everything in context has been James. From Putin keeping Abe waiting 3 hours at an onsen in Yamaguchi, to how East Asia is viewing the Ukraine war. James has been an invaluable source of information and advice for me and many other Tokyo-based journalists. He's fluent in both Russian and Japanese, and that, along with his academic credentials, make him the perfect person to write a book about Russian espionage against Japan. And as great as the tales are of the colorful characters in his book, it's also a very handy guide to the history of Japan-Russia ties over the past century or so. It goes back to Russia's clumsy attempts to gather information about Japan in the lead up to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-5, through to the spy ring of Richard Sorge, the famed Soviet spy in Tokyo in the 1930s, who penetrated elite Japanese and German circles and provided intelligence that arguably influenced decisions made during World War II. The title of the book, Cracking the Crab, comes from a remark by Sorge, who compared Japan to a crab. The outer shell, which he saw as Japan's closed insular society, was extremely hard to crack, but once a spy got inside, there was a rich trove of secrets beneath the surface. So it's my pleasure to introduce James tonight, who's going to give a short presentation about his book, which is available for sale here and at a more expensive price at the front desk. So I think... Good man. 4,000 yen versus 6,000. Yep. Anyway, I'll leave it to James. He'll talk for 20, 30 minutes with some slides, and then we'll open the floor to some Q&A. And the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very kind of generous introduction. Thank you also to the FCCJ for hosting me, and thank you all very much for coming. Writing a book is a pretty lonely business, and as you're working away on your own, one thing that kept me going is thinking about the end result and the opportunity to present it to readers. So it's very kind of you to come along and show interest in this work. So I do have some slides to share with you. Are they coming up? Yeah, there we go. So let's get started straight away. There we go. Okay, so I thought I'd start by saying a bit about the origin of the book. So my background is as someone focused on Russian politics. My PhD in the UK actually had nothing to do with Japan whatsoever. It was entirely to do with Russian foreign policy, particularly energy-related issues. But I was fortunate enough to receive a scholarship to come to Japan in 2011. I thought, I don't want to give up on all of this Russia stuff I've been spending years working on, what to focus on. So I ended up focusing on Russia's relations with Japan and more broadly East Asia. I wrote a book about the territorial dispute. That came out, I suppose, about 10 years ago. And after that, I worked on a few other projects, some edited books, but I decided I wanted to work on another monograph, something that I could really devote an extended period of time to, really get my teeth into it. There were a few false starts. I had this idea of writing a book about Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I put a few months into that, and I realized that while some of my diplomat friends might be interested in reading that, probably not so many other people would be. So instead, I thought, what do people like to read about? Something that might appeal not just to an academic audience, but to a broader general public as well. And I thought, how about spies? Everyone likes a good spy story. So this is the origin of this book. And I found out that actually there was rather a lot of Russian espionage towards Japan over the years. So it has become two books. This is the first. It is from, in a sense, early encounters through to 1945. And the second volume is not yet out. So perhaps there might be an opportunity for a similar event to this again in the future. So more specifically then, what is this book all about? Well, firstly, straightforwardly, it's a history of Russian espionage against Japan, highlighting that whilst many people know the story of Richard Sorge, that's well told, not just by the book, a recent book by Owen Matthews, Impeccable Spy, which is excellent, but there've been many other books in the past as well. It's a great story, but it's just one instance. And the broader story of all of the other intelligence officers and agents who have spied on Japan from Moscow has not been so well told, at least not in English. So I focus on, of course, the stealing of secret information, but that's only one part of espionage. There's also the influence operations, and that's a big part of this book as well. So that's the first goal. The second one is to tell the story of Japan-Russia relations through the lens of espionage. Books that are written about the bilateral relationship often focus on the territorial issues. Understandably, that is the major unresolved issue between the two sides. That's the reason why there's no peace treaty between the two. But it's still only one part of the relationship. So in this book, if you read it, as I hope you all will, you will find that by looking at the espionage angle of it, it's a way of learning so much more about the broader relationship, right through from the 18th century to the 20th. And as I say in the book, that's because espionage, like warfare, is the continuation of politics by other means. So a sort of manipulation of a Clausewitz quote. So by looking at what Moscow was trying to achieve through intelligence operations, you learn a lot about what its broader strategic ambitions were towards its eastern neighbor. But I also wanted to write a book that was at least in part entertaining. I hope my students will also read this book, and they're not going to if it's a dry, tedious tome. So wherever possible, I've included things that at least entertained me, and hopefully will entertain you as well. So a little example there was one instance where a Soviet reconnaissance unit put on sheepskin coats and infiltrated a flock of sheep in order to get close to Japanese lines. And I rather enjoyed imagining that situation. Now, it is a work of history, but a further objective I can add in there is to, I suppose, give some insight into how Japan can better protect itself. Some of the weaknesses that were exploited by Russian spies in the period up until 1945, in some ways, are still weaknesses today. So by looking at what led to successes by Moscow in the past, perhaps there are some policy relevant things as well. So more specifically then, what is this book all about? Well, firstly, straightforwardly, it's a history of Russian espionage against Japan, highlighting that whilst many people know the story of Richard Sorge, that's well told, not just by the book, a recent book by Owen Matthews, Impeccable Spy, which is excellent, but there've been many other books in the past as well. It's a great story, but it's just one instance. And the broader story of all of the other intelligence officers and agents who have spied on Japan from Moscow has not been so well told, at least not in English. So I focus on, of course, the stealing of secret information, but that's only one part of espionage. There's also the influence operations, and that's a big part of this book as well. So that's the first goal. The second one is to tell the story of Japan-Russia relations through the lens of espionage. Books that are written about the bilateral relationship often focus on the territorial issues. Understandably, That is the major unresolved issue between the two sides. That's the reason why there's no peace treaty between the two. But it's still only one part of the relationship. So in this book, if you read it, as I hope you all will, you will find that by looking at the espionage angle of it, it's a way of learning so much more about the broader relationship, right through from the 18th century to the 20th. And as I say in the book, that's because espionage, like warfare, is the continuation of politics by other means. So a sort of manipulation of a Clausewitz quote. So by looking at what Moscow was trying to achieve through intelligence operations, you learn a lot about what its broader strategic ambitions were towards its eastern neighbor. But I also wanted to write a book that was at least in part entertaining. I hope my students will also read this book, and they're not going to if it's a dry, tedious tome. So wherever possible, I've included things that at least entertained me, and hopefully will entertain you as well. So a little example there was one instance where a Soviet reconnaissance unit put on sheepskin coats and infiltrated a flock of sheep in order to get close to Japanese lines. And I rather enjoyed imagining that situation. Now, it is a work of history, but a further objective I can add in there is to, I suppose, give some insight into how Japan can better protect itself. Some of the weaknesses that were exploited by Russian spies in the period up until 1945, in some ways are still weaknesses today. So by looking at what led to successes by Moscow in the past, perhaps there are some policy relevant things as well. Okay, a little word about the slide there. Most of you will know the figure in the bottom right, that is Richard Sorge. There'll be more about him later on. But the figure who's rather inexpertly been circled by me in red is a figure that you probably don't know, Izumi Kozo. There's more about him later on. And you might argue he deserves to be much better known than he is. Anyway, I return to him a little bit later on. So it's a relatively long book. It was actually much longer. At one point, it was 160,000 words. And the publisher said, yes, James, great. But if you wouldn't mind making it about a third shorter, then we might actually publish it for you. So there was a very painful process for me of cutting down about 50,000 words, which took rather a long time. But nonetheless, it is still quite a detailed book. So this is the broad table of contents. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of it in great detail. But it does begin in the 18th century. At that stage, it's questionable whether we're really talking about espionage in the modern sense. Some of it is more acts of kind of exploration, but there are several really interesting stories from that period. We then move forward to the 19th century after the opening up of Japan, and Japan starts to become a real competitor in Northeast Asia, with that competition, even before the Russo-Japanese War, being played out in Korea and Manchuria. And at that stage, still Russia very much getting the upper hand, especially in Korea. And there's an interesting story along in that era when the Russian side succeeds in smuggling the Korean king out of the palace, disguised in women's clothing, in order to get him out from under Japanese influence to the safety of the Russian legation. And then he is encouraged to dismiss the more Japan-friendly cabinet. So that was one success achieved by the Russian side in that period of the late 19th century. We then move on to the Russo-Japanese War, clearly a time when it's Japan that has the upper hand in the intelligence conflict. But then with the opening of relations between Japan and the Soviet Union in 1925, that means that the Soviet embassy can open up, and no great secret, embassies operate also as hubs for espionage. So you have a lot of influence exercised out of that embassy and also with Japanese left-wingers in that period. Also included is the Battle of Nomonhan, which I think you can really consider an undeclared war. It's a really large-scale conflict. And then moving forward to the things which are perhaps a bit more familiar. I do have a chapter on the Sorge Ozaki spy ring. That's the bit that many of you might know a bit more about. But instead of focusing just on the figure of Sorge, as remarkable a figure as he was, I draw attention to some of the other characters who played very prominent roles within that spy ring, including Ozaki Hotsumi, who I'll speak more about a little bit later. And then also to Sorge's contemporaries. The Soviet intelligence services believed in volume, even though they had this well-established spy ring operating in Tokyo in the late 1930s. They wanted to supplement it with other officers and agents. So I'll speak a bit later on about some of those contemporaries of Richard Sorge. And then it finishes off with a chapter that I've rather, I suppose, cheekily entitled, How to Spy on Japan. A sort of textbook if any of you are considering taking on that career. But the purpose of it is not to encourage spying on Japan, far from it. It's rather to highlight weaknesses so that they can be better addressed. Okay, so that's the overall table of contents. And if there are questions that relate to some of those chapters, I'll be very happy to address them. But in my initial comments, I'm mainly going to focus on the latter parts of the book, on those last 3 chapters, 8, 9, and then the conclusion. But as I say, if you want to ask about those earlier chapters, I'm very happy to speak about them. And a little word about the figure pictured here. This is a remarkable individual, Vasily Ashepkov. Now, he was sent to Japan as a young man, when it was still the Russian Empire, in order to undergo training at the seminary attached to the Russian Orthodox Cathedral in Tokyo. Now, the cathedral itself was not directly involved in espionage, but the security authorities saw it as a sort of way of training spies on the cheap. So Ashepkov and others, young men, were sent there. They learned excellent Japanese. They learned all about Japanese culture. And then later on, they were used by the Russian Empire, and then later on, in the case of Ashepkov, by the Soviets in order to spy on the Japanese. Now, he's particularly remarkable because he was also very talented in martial arts, in judo, and then also as a founder of Sambo, a Russian martial art which has some similarities with judo. He ultimately didn't work out well for him. He was arrested under the Stalinist purges and executed as a Japanese spy. Anyway, I can speak more about him later on if you wish, but I'll move on now to emphasizing about the title. Andy very kindly already mentioned some of this. No problem at all, but it is rather an odd title. And I did think, should I really go for this? It wasn't imposed by the publisher. Sometimes that happens. It's my own choice. But yes, maybe some people, it might be included in some bookshops in, I don't know, the seafood section. But the reason is because it's from a Richard Sorge quote. So this is what I write in the book. Over the centuries, Japan has often been a hard target for espionage, due to its history of national isolationism, suspicion of foreigners, especially Russians, and insular political elite. However, if this tough exterior can be breached, there is a soft inner layer where information controls are lacking. This is what Richard Sorge meant when he said that Japan is like a crab. The history of Russian espionage against Japan shows that Russia has often been successful in cracking Japan's outer shell and feasting upon the abundance of intelligence material within. So that's why I went for this title. And what I explain in the book is that, yes, often it was really tough for some of these Russian intelligence officers. Many of them really struggled. The language barrier was one of the principal difficulties. But then the few that really succeeded achieved great success for their country. Okay, so I'm going to look at how some of them achieved this by focusing on some of the things that were used to great success. One of them is the charisma of certain Soviet and Russian intelligence officers, their use of expertise, their use of flattery, and then their ability to exploit certain vulnerabilities, especially the vulnerability of some Japanese to blackmail, including emotional blackmail. And also I'll mention about the front cover. This was designed by one of my students, actually, at TUJ, not one of the students of international politics, but rather we have a graphic design department. And so one of the students kindly came up with this design for me. Right, okay, so first of all, the use of charisma. Oh, sorry, I've gone too far. There we go. The use of charisma. Now, as I've said, I want this book to be much more than about Sorge, but he is such a remarkable character, we can't entirely ignore him. So this will be perhaps familiar to many of you, but Richard Sorge, German national, born in Baku to a German father, a Russian mother, fought for the German army in the First World War, was injured, and that process radicalized him. So, he wasn't the only one in that situation. That was the story of Adolf Hitler as well. In his experience of the First World War. I'm not drawing a broader comparison between Sorge and Hitler here, certainly not, but I'm just pointing out that there are certain commonalities for a certain generation of German soldiers who were radicalized as a result of their experience of the First World War. So he became a Marxist. And having become a Marxist and being active in German circles for a period of time, he made the move to Moscow. Initially working for the Comintern, and then later on being employed by Soviet military intelligence. He was sent to Shanghai, first of all, and then later on to Tokyo. And one of his great successes, which he achieved both in Shanghai and also in Tokyo, was just his personality. Almost as soon as he'd arrived in Tokyo, he became the center of the German community. He just seemed to have a magnetic personality. The Jürgen Ott, who went on to become the German ambassador, described him as irresistible. He just had a very attractive personality. People wanted to spend time with him. Others described him as a social lion. He's been described also as a sort of Soviet James Bond. Lots of girls, parties, motorbikes. Now, this was very valuable in terms of access. He didn't really have to seek out access. If someone were to be really trying to force themselves into positions of influence, that would raise suspicions. But he didn't have to. He was invited into the German embassy. Ott, who I mentioned, the ambassador, he tried to persuade Sorge to have a full-time job within the embassy, in part because of his charismatic personality. And that was also a very good way of hiding in plain sight. Now, he made lots of missteps, getting drunk, crashing his motorbike. When Barbarossa was launched in 1941, he got drunk and started shouting anti-Hitler kind of statements in a hotel bar. But instead of that raising suspicions, a member of the German embassy who overheard him instead looked after him, found him a room for the evening and led him kind of up to the room so he could sleep off his alcohol. So that sort of charisma, that charm really helped him. Didn't help him in the long run, I suppose. He was ultimately arrested in late 1941 and executed in 1944. Okay, so that's one thing that certainly helped Sorge. But what else has been a key factor for some? Well, I want here to concentrate on the most important agent within Sorge's spy ring, Ozaki Hotsumi. Now, Sorge is often regarded as someone who spied on Japan. Well, that's where he was, but really he was spying on Germany via his access to the ambassador, to the embassy. And his information about Japan didn't come directly. He wasn't gathering that himself so much. It was rather through his network of agents, principally Ozaki Hotsumi, a Japanese journalist originally, who he met first of all in Shanghai. Now, Ozaki was a fantastic source for Sorge and then more broadly for the Soviet Union, primarily because of his expertise. Again, he didn't have to approach people so much to try and gain access. They came to him. That's because this was a time when, of course, many people in Japan needed expertise on China, and Ozaki had it in spades. He was born within Japan, but spent some of his childhood growing up in Taiwan. He was then sent to work in Shanghai as a journalist for the Asahi Shimbun, and he really built up his expertise on the country. So when he returned to Japan, he was approached by many people for his expertise. He wrote books on China. And so whilst they were coming to him to ask for things, that was a great way for him to learn about their knowledge of Japanese policy. In particular, through his expertise in China, he established especially good relations with Saionji Kinkazu, who was a member of the Japanese aristocracy, and in particular, the grandson of Saionji Kinmochi, who was, a prominent member of the Japanese aristocracy, very influential within political circles. And because of the absence of information controls within the Japanese elite, because there was trust amongst these figures, that meant that information was shared very widely. So that's where we have this soft inner layer within the outer shell. So Ozaki was invited to join the so-called Breakfast Club of advisors to Prime Minister Konoe Fumimaro. And in that, he gained access to information, but was also able, at least in part, to try and influence the direction of policy, to argue, for example, much better to concentrate Japan's efforts in going south rather than north. So he was able to double up, both as an excellent source of information, but also, at least in part, to try and influence Japanese government policy. Sadly for Ozaki, his career ended in the same way as Sorge. He was arrested at almost exactly the same time and was executed on the same morning in 1944. Okay, so expertise really worked for Ozaki as a way of gaining access. And I think that just as it worked in that era, my guess is it would work well today also. If you could establish yourself in Tokyo as a really recognized expert on some hot topic, whether that might be China, cybersecurity, AI issues, and people were coming to you, that could really be something that could be used by intelligence sources. Okay, so that's expertise. My next one is flattery. And this takes me to the case of one of Sorge's contemporaries. So, although they had this excellent source, this excellent spy ring led by Sorge, Russian, I should say Soviet military intelligence wanted to double up, wanted to have other sources. They sent several other people, and one of them was Aino Kusinen. And she had a remarkable background. She was the wife to Otto Kusinen, who was a prominent early Bolshevik and was the head of the Comintern for an extended period of time. But after their relationship broke down, she was recruited by Soviet military intelligence. She spent some time in the United States, but then she was sent to Japan. And her role was very different to that of Sorge. While Sorge was concentrating on the German embassy, Ozaki concentrating on political circles, her role was to focus on high society, to attend fancy parties, to meet aristocrats, prominent kind of politicians, and to play the role as perhaps a bit of a naive foreigner, to encourage men to take her under their wing and show her around Japan. So she came here in the guise of Elizabeth Hansen, a Swedish writer. And after spending some time in Japan, she left the country again, went to Sweden, and wrote this book, Smiling Japan. And it was an incredibly flattering book about the country, all about how Japan was misunderstood. No, it wasn't an authoritarian, aggressive, militarist state. It was a friendly, welcoming place that had just been maligned by international society. And this worked exceptionally well. It was published in 1936, and the Soviet intelligence services rushed it into translation. And this really opened doors to her within Japan. You can imagine how the Japanese elite were delighted by this foreigner who was very happy to praise the country. So things were going really well for her. And I'm very interested in how it might have worked out had she remained within the country. But in 1937, Moscow recalled all of its overseas spies in Japan, and indeed elsewhere. And Sorge ignored the order. He stayed on and became this famous, historic figure. Kuusinen obeyed the order. She went back and was promptly sent off to a forced labor camp, where she remained for 8 years, survived, was eventually released, and then defected to the West, which is why we have her story. But it's very interesting. If she had remained, she'd in a sense done the hard work. She might have ended up being a much more effective spy had she been able to remain. And again, I think that role of flattery, it worked in the 1930s. I could see that working again these days. Okay, so that's about the first three approaches. On to exploiting weaknesses. And here we introduce that figure who I mentioned at the beginning. That's that picture again, Izumi Kozo. Really doesn't get that much attention at all. But he was a very, very important agent for the Soviet Union. And again, a contemporary of Richard Sorge. So Izumi was a Japanese diplomat. He was posted to Moscow as soon as official relations were opened in 1925. And it seems there was a degree of naivety at the time. They didn't quite anticipate the extent to which they would be targeted by Soviet intelligence services. So he was given a place to live. Now, we don't know exactly the circumstances. Maybe it was just love. Or maybe this had been arranged by Moscow from the very start. He was placed with a landlady who had 2 daughters, and soon enough he ends up marrying one of them, Yelena Perskaya. Now, it could well be that they just hit it off, or it could have been right from the beginning. It was the intention of Soviet intelligence to place a wife with him who would then spy upon him and exert leverage upon him. So we don't know exactly the circumstances, but they marry. A son is born in 1930, but then before too long, you have Yelena being pressured to spy upon Izumi. It seems that she shows some resistance, and so leverage needs to be exerted on her. This is the Stalinist era. So her mother is sent off to the Gulag. Both her sister and her brother-in-law are both executed. So she's pressured into spying on her husband. She does so, and then she recruits him. And Izumi begins to provide very valuable information to the Soviet side, principally to assist their signals intelligence. He hands over code books, he hands over coded telegrams, and this gives the Soviet side enough material to be able to get access to a lot of Japanese diplomatic communications. And so for much of the wartime period, the Soviets seem to have access to a lot of Japan's diplomatic communications, valuable to understand what the Japanese side is intending, but also Japan, of course, knows a lot about its German ally. So it's a good source for the Soviet Union on Germany as well. And it's pretty clear that the Soviets highly regard Izumi's information. Sergei Tolstoy, who was the lead Soviet cryptanalyst focused on Japan, was the most decorated of their cryptanalysts during the war. That seems to indicate he had some considerable success. And also it's indicated that Stalin, who was very suspicious of Sorge's intelligence, had greater trust in signals intelligence. That's understandable. Spies are people who lie for a career. Can you entirely trust what they're telling you? Certainly Stalin was suspicious. He notoriously described Sorge, despite the excellent material he was providing, as, excuse the language, a shit who set himself up with some small factories and brothels in Japan. He did not believe Sorge's warnings of Barbarossa. He did, it seems, place greater emphasis on signals intelligence, because it's not coming via a spy. In a sense, it's coming directly from the horse's mouth. So it seems that thanks to access to this diplomatic communications, the Soviet side gained insight into this Japan-German plot to assassinate Stalin, which ultimately went nowhere. Warnings of Barbarossa, which were largely ignored, but then also the reassurance that Japan would not join Germany in attacking the Soviet Union in the second half of 1941. That's the thing which makes Richard Sorge particularly famous, but it seems that Izumi was passing on the same confirming intelligence. Okay, so what happened to Izumi? Well, he was never essentially caught. At the end of the war, he returned to Japan. He had lost touch with his wife and son, and after a few years of trying to get it back on his feet, it's obviously a very difficult situation in Japan at that time. He was living with his sister in poverty. Things are better by 1948, and he approaches the Soviet embassy, seeking information on his wife and son. They say, oh yes, certainly, we'll look into that for you. And then they re-recruit him. So he was no longer a Japanese diplomat. He didn't have access to the same information, but he could still draw upon his network of contacts. And he met with his Soviet handler about 40 times after the war between 1948 and 1952, getting a regular salary each month. And the only reason that he was ever defected is because the individual pictured there, Yuri Rastvorov, very prominent Soviet intelligence officer, defected in 1954, defected from Japan to the United States and told the US and subsequently Japan all he knew about Soviet agents within the country, and that included Izumi. So Japanese police visited him twice, but by that stage he was a very ill man. He was coming towards the end of his life. He admitted to working for the Soviets post-war, but not for his work for them during the war, and then died from high blood pressure in July 1954. So really a remarkable figure. I'm happy to talk more about him in Q&A, but I'm mindful of the time. So instead, just very briefly, I'll finish off with a few comments about what Japan can do to better protect itself, very topical, given that after the election, the issue of an anti-spy law is likely to return to prominence. So much of this is obvious, really. Better information security. Both in this book and its successor, I found many cases where there's just been the expectation to pass on information, in particular with the Kohai-senpai relationship, where you have, for instance, a former boss approaching a former subordinate and saying, it'd be terribly helpful if you could share some information. Of course they shouldn't, but they feel a strong obligation to their former superior. That sort of thing has been really quite damaging. Also, counterintelligence. Japan, for historic reasons after the war, decided to fragment its intelligence and counterintelligence capabilities to avoid having an excessively powerful security state. You could make the case now that some of that fragmentation needs to be reversed. And then also, I'll be very happy to discuss this issue of an anti-spy law as well. But as I say, I'm mindful of the time, so I'll stop there for the time being and very much welcome your questions.
Thank you, James. Okay, so opening the floor up to Q&A now. Please raise your hands and I'll try to get to as many people as possible. And when you speak, please try to come up to one of the two mics at the front and give your name and affiliation if you can. Okay. Anyone going first? Very shy bunch. Okay, I'll kick something off. So spin this to the modern day. I mean, obviously, it's hard to know a lot, but is there still a lot of these kind of figures in Moscow and Tokyo circles that are spying on each other's countries that you're aware of?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'm focused here on, Russian espionage, but I don't want to give the impression that Russia, in a sense, is that unusual here. Countries spy on each other. If you are a developed country with sophisticated capabilities, most countries will try and gather intelligence on, in particular, potential adversaries. So it's not terribly surprising that Russia should do this. And are they continuing to do so? Of course they are, especially in the circumstances where Russia has categorized Japan as an unfriendly state after the start of the conflict in Ukraine, after Japan's imposition of sanctions. And so for that reason, yes, absolutely, Russia is continuing these activities. And it includes all of the things which have been going on for many decades. That includes stealing secrets, a big part of espionage, whether those secrets are political, military, or technological. But it also includes influence operations. That means trying to, well, for one, seek ways of weakening the alliance between Japan and the United States. I think from Moscow's perspective, there's a recognition that that serves the interests of both Japan and the US. So if you can weaken that, for instance, by encouraging anti-US sentiment within Japan, perhaps encouraging anti-base sentiment, then that serves Moscow's interests. So yeah, absolutely, it's still going on. Now, numbers, we can't know for definite. But there was a book which was published by a former Japanese counterintelligence officer, and he put the number at 80. 80 Russian intelligence officers within the country. Now, if that's accurate or not, I don't know. But he is in a position to know, and that was his estimate.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please, sir.
Ken Moskowitz at Temple University. James, it was a wonderful presentation and really sparked my interest in a lot of the topics you raised. I guess the question I have is, what was going through my mind as you spoke is, what about sources? You're basically writing about secrets and intelligence, and although you said the Japanese doesn't have good information control, you can't really go in, I suspect, to a Russian archive these days. How do you get information on the Russian side and here in Japan? What barriers did you have to overcome? Thank you.
Thank you very much. A good sort of academic question there, and a very important one. Yeah, it's tricky. It's not the sort of area where you can really expect archival access, even if the circumstances were different in Russia from how they are today. So it means you really just have to work with the bits and pieces that are available. But the most valuable are the defectors. And that's the moment when you can really get a lot of sort of confirmed information. And from going from that, you can then use that as the starting point to explore other information. And aside from that, it's really trying to make use of sources in both Russian and Japanese. And in Japanese in particular, there is better material. There is stuff which has been written about Izumi Kozo, for example. Not that much, but there is some. So some of it is secondary material as well as the primary material from the defectors. Now, this is spinning it forward to more recent times, which is the focus of the second book. But I mentioned Rastvorov, but the other major defector was Stanislav Levchenko, who defected from Tokyo to the United States in 1979. And he provided a large amount of material as well. So that was the real sort of the flood of information. Elsewhere, you're really just trying to pick bits and pieces. So that leads to the conclusion that I've written the best book that I can on this, but there has to be the recognition that there will be intelligence officers and agents, including highly successful ones that have never been identified. And that would be really fascinating. I wonder if we will ever know. But I fully accept that there will be major cases which are missing from this. I don't know about them, and they've never made it into the public realm. Thank you.
Over there, please. Thank you.
Christoph Neidhardt, retired now. Spying seems to me to be an extremely inefficient business. I have interviewed people who lived through the war years here in Tokyo, or at the end in Karuizawa. They got visits from the Kenpai twice a week, and the Kenpai interviewed the cook about possible spying activities. And now the idea was that, so you spoke about better counterintelligence. Obviously, that was counterintelligence. Mm-hmm. Then Sorge's most famous success is predicting Barbarossa. And that Stalin didn't believe it. So that's another missed success. Do you have examples where we have political conclusions that actually mattered for spying? I mean, going back to the late 18th centuries as well, when they had these Russian capsized people in Petersburg and in Irkutsk, and they interviewed them for weeks. Well, the Russians didn't gain anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. So I completely agree. I think it is a very inefficient business. Most intelligence officers probably never achieve that much. They no doubt go out on their postings dreaming of being the next Richard Sorge or whatever, but probably they gather little of value. They probably spend a lot of time paying money, cultivating agents that never really deliver very much. But I suppose what the alternative is if you don't have those intelligence capabilities, you could miss something really major. You need to understand what the intentions are of other countries. Some of that will come through your diplomats. But for things which are not ever going to make it into the more sort of open domain, you need to have people to try and pick it up. So when it comes to, well, in fact, I've got an example of an inefficient Soviet spy, another contemporary of Sorge, John Sherman. a US communist who was sent to Japan around the same time. He was here in the 1930s, and it seems he achieved absolutely nothing. Well, I say that. He did win a handball competition. So he was involved in some sort of sporting activity, but then they feared that he had been kind of exposed and was withdrawn. A lot of investment, a lot of effort, nothing achieved. So that's not at all uncommon. But there can be exceptions. And I think that I would disagree slightly in what Sorge's main achievement was. Whilst he did deliver the information on Barbarossa, which was ignored, subsequently, he did deliver the information that Japan had decided not to strike north against the Soviet Union, and that did seem to be listened to. And that's why Sorge gets all of this attention, because many authors credit his intelligence with giving the Soviet Union the confidence to transfer units from the far east of the country to the defense of Moscow. And it seems that information provided by Izumi, helping access to Japanese diplomatic communications, helped to confirm that. So that's a really good example in that for all of the failures and inefficiencies, getting something like that is priceless. So that's the real standout example. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. While people are thinking of their next questions, I've got one for you. Tell me a little bit about, for the layman, about this anti-spy law that Japan is trying to introduce. And could you give me your views on it, please?
Thank you very much. So a bit of context to this, that during the period up until 1945, Japan had truly draconian laws against spying, including a notorious law from 1925, which included the death penalty. And understandably, in 1945, there was then the desire to get away from that history of authoritarianism and the police state. So as well as the fragmentation of the intelligence services, you have nothing replacing those wartime 1930s and before laws. So as a result of that, Japan has, until this day, never had an anti-spy law. Now you might be thinking, well, what about the designated secrets law that was introduced under Abe, was highly controversial at the time, street protests? Well, that did go some way in protecting certain designated secrets. And yet the act of working for a foreign intelligence service for an ordinary Japanese citizen remained not illegal. And that is very unusual. It is not the case with any other G7 member. So that would seem to be a pretty obvious kind of hole. Now, it's been recognized for a long time that the absence of that legislation has been a problem. After Levchenko's defection in 1979, when he revealed that there were several prominent politicians, including someone who had been a member of the cabinet, he said had been agents of the Soviet Union. That was Ishida Hirohide. You can look him up if you like. So Levchenko alleged that he was a Soviet agent. That created a great scandal. Alleged that several senior members of the Socialist Party were agents, several journalists as well. And then that was followed in short order by the revelation that a retired member of the ground self-defense forces had also been selling secrets to the Soviet embassy. So in the early 1980s, there was a real sense that Japan had become a spy paradise. That was the term that was used by then Prime Minister Nakasone. And so it was this effort to try and bring in an anti-spy law in 1985. But frankly, it wasn't handled very well. The wording of the law was rather vague, meaning that perhaps too much could be included in espionage, and also they wanted to include the death penalty. So as a result of that, it was too easy for critics to be able to say, this is going back to the bad old days. It was heavily criticized in the media by opposition parties, and the effort failed. So in 1985, no anti-spy law was introduced. And I think also a factor might have been when we get into the 2000s and so on, when you have the coalition between the LDP and Komeito were always very hesitant on something like an anti-spy law. Now, however, it's a different coalition. We don't know what's going to happen in the election, but if we have the renewed coalition between Jiminto and Komeito, if anything, Jiminto and Ishin, then if anything, Ishin are more enthusiastic about an anti-spy law. So in her speech that she made yesterday, Takaichi included her commitment to move forward urgently with anti-spy legislation. So it is going to be controversial. It's going to lead to a lot of criticism, I think, within Japan, from China, from Russia, who will no doubt say, Japan's going back to the bad old days. But in my view, of course, you have to be so careful with enhancing the powers of the state. But in my view, looking at all of these cases, and I'm just looking at the Russian ones, there are no doubt lots of others from China, from North Korea, from others. I think it's urgently needed. And I would say the same also about Japan having a proper external intelligence service as well. Thank you. It says Maxwell's got a question. Yes, sir.
Thank you, James. Maxwell Dalman from the British Embassy. Can't wait to read the book. I actually have two questions, if I may. The first is you talked a lot about, in your speech, about sort of the history leading up to World War II, but did the same themes of sort of flattery, bribery, and blackmail sort of, did they represent early spy history, sort of like late Tokugawa, Meiji era interactions between Russia and Japan? And my second question is, in researching the book, did you come across lots of examples of Japanese spying on Russia? And is there perhaps a book in the future on that as well? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So if we go back to the earlier period, I think the main difference was essentially until the Russo-Japanese War, the Russians didn't really rate Japan that much as an adversary. They significantly underestimated Japan's capabilities. And so they didn't really take espionage against Japan as seriously as they might have done. So they were involved in intrigue in Manchuria, in Korea. They were involved in, for instance, bribing Chinese officials in order to lean more towards the Russian side rather than towards Japan. But within Japan itself, much less so. And I was very interested in the period leading up to the Russo-Japanese War. In the late 19th century, first few years of the 20th century. And you have within Tokyo all of these Russian spy scares. In the media, there's all of these fears of Russian spies everywhere. But the reality was there was very little, because the Russians were not really taking the Japanese threat that seriously. And it was only after the Russo-Japanese War and Russia's famous defeat that then they were like, okay, we really need to professionalize our intelligence operations. We need to scale them up significantly. So I think that's really a significant turning point. And they did learn very much from that chastening defeat and improved their capabilities significantly. Now, on the topic of Japanese spying on Russia, yes. So this is one of the interesting things about the post-war period. So Japan essentially forgot almost everything that it knew about doing influence operations and spying. But up until 1945, they were actually very good. They had a significant number of undercover intelligence officers operating within Russia, conducting the gathering of information, but also influence operations. I mean, it's not something that I've studied in detail as yet, but there's the suggestion that Bloody Sunday, the original Bloody Sunday, which contributed to the revolution of 1905 in Russia, in part was instigated by Japanese intelligence. And so that sounds a fascinating story. So who knows that I'm going to spend a bit of time not writing books because it's hard work. So I'm going to spend a few months doing shorter articles, but when I return to it, sure, I might well consider looking at, especially because if Japan does set up an external intelligence agency, they're going to have to try and emulate some of their historic successes. Thank you.
Okay.
If nobody else asks, Russia is the only country Japan had a land border with for a few decades. You haven't mentioned Sakhalin yet. I assume there at that land border there was some intelligence gathering operations going on. Can you say a few words about Sakhalin?
Yeah, thank you very much. So, yes, you have earlier on the period when Sakhalin is essentially shared. Even before you have the official border, you have this kind of odd arrangement where there's just sort of shared jurisdiction of Sakhalin, and then you have the land border. And indeed, there was spying on the Japanese there, and including by Ashepkov, who I mentioned earlier on, the guy who is credited with creating Sambo. But that's not the only time that they had their land border, because after you have the creation of Manchukuo, essentially it being a puppet state, you then have a very extensive land border between essentially the Japanese Empire and the Soviet Union. And that created a huge amount of nervousness on the Soviet side that could this aggressive kind of Japan, as it was seen, strike against the Soviet Union. And at a time when Soviet forces in the Far East were quite limited. So they were very nervous about that. And that played a big role then again when we look at the Khalkhin-Gol-Nomonhan conflict. So there, it's a conflict, as most of you will know, essentially a border conflict between the puppet state in Manchuria and Mongolia, a Soviet satellite. And their intelligence on the Soviet side was crucial because they wanted to know how far they could push the Japanese without provoking a full-scale conflict. So they wanted essentially to give the Japanese side a bloody nose so they wouldn't try again. And they did that very effectively. But they didn't want to push it so far that it led to a full-scale conflict. And so their intelligence sources from Tokyo, including Sorge, informed them that Japan has no intention of fighting a full-scale war at this time. And so then they could be like, okay, great, we can really hammer the Japanese forces, which they did, without it leading to a full-scale conflict. So I think those two borders are really interesting, both Sakhalin and then also with Manchukuo. Thank you.
Given that you've finished writing your next book and you probably don't want to think about it right now, but perhaps you could just share with the audience what kind of themes, what kind of people you touch upon in that book.
Well, I've got a slide on that because I thought that would come up. So if it's okay to share again, then I'll give you a little bit of a taster of the next book. Where is it? Here we go. So the second volume, provisional title, Spy Paradise. Thought that might be quite good as a title. Russian espionage against Japan, from Cold War conspiracies to cyber espionage. So yes, I have finished writing the draft, but I don't have a publication date. But a little indication of some of the things which are included. So if we start in the bottom left, it begins with the end of the Second World War and the sending of around 500,000 Japanese personnel, soldiers, off to Siberia to be held in labor camps, used as a labor force, but also used for indoctrination. There was this idea of encouraging communist thought amongst these individuals, and they were sort of attractive targets in a way. They had experience of one authoritarian regime, lending their loyalty to the militarist regime and the emperor within Japan. The hope was perhaps they could transfer that loyalty to Marxism instead. So there was a very extensive program of indoctrination with the idea that they could then be sent back to Japan as a red wave that would bring a socialist revolution to Japan. And it didn't succeed overall, but there were several individuals within that group who did, it seems, become agents of the Soviet Union. And maybe the most interesting of them is the individual pictured at the top right, the one standing in a courtroom. So that is Sejima Ryuzo. Now, I don't have conclusive evidence that he was a Soviet agent, but there are many people who believe that he was. We have to be very careful about just calling people spies. So we can't say for definite, but there are lots of suspicious things about his activity. After returning from a Soviet labor camp, he became a very prominent figure, both within Japanese business and as an advisor within politics. And many people believe that he might have tried to influence Japanese politics in a pro-Soviet direction. So he gets a chapter. If we continue round, that's Ishida Hirohide, who's the cabinet minister who was named by Levchenko. Rastvorov is the one in the tie next to the marching Japanese soldiers. He's the one who defected in 1954 and revealed a lot of information. Levchenko's the defector in 79. And the last one I'll tell you about is the one bottom right, because this is in many ways the most remarkable story. This individual's name, real name, is Yevgeny Kim, ethnic Korean, was born in what is now South Korea, but then was transferred, if I remember correctly, to Sakhalin. And so he grew up learning and knowing both Russian and Japanese. And Soviet intelligence recognized the opportunity to use him as an illegal. That is, someone under non-official cover who seemingly has no connection whatsoever with the Soviet Union. And so what happened was that there was an individual in Fukushima prefecture called Kuroba Ichiro, an ordinary Japanese guy working, it seems, as a dental technician. And one day he told his partner he was going off to meet friends in the mountains, and he disappeared. No idea what happened to him. But the next year, Yevgeny Kim appeared in Tokyo having stolen the identity of this individual, Kuroba. And for the next 30 years, Yevgeny Kim operated in Japan as an undercover agent. Now, we don't know exactly what he was doing, but it seems that he was one of these individuals who wasn't inefficient, who did have success because he was awarded the status of hero of the Soviet Union, the same status as Richard Sorge. And so precisely what he achieved, we can only speculate. But that's one of the remarkable stories that is also featured in the second volume. But when, and indeed if, the second volume gets published, in part depends on if anyone buys the first volume. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in the second one, to also support the first.
Yes, please.
Hi, Chris Lamont from Tokyo International University. I was actually hesitating to ask this question, but since you put up this slide, I guess I will. I really enjoyed the book because it tells a lot of very human stories. And I think that's kind of part of what makes it very interesting. But I was curious about the second volume in a sense that as humans, the role of humans in the mix of ways states get information about other states has changed. I'm curious about the cyber espionage, I guess, element of the second book. So, is there something that you could share about that and about the changing mix of tools for intelligence gathering and how that's impacted this? Yeah.
Thanks very much. So this is the final chapter of the second volume, which is indeed on cyber and information operations. So with cyber, there are different strands to it. The one is what I suppose we would call, cyber espionage, which is when you are directly seeking to access and steal secrets from, say, Japan's Ministry of Defense. And it's not so much on the Russian side, but rather there are good indications that China was very successful in accessing Japanese ministries. And so there's every expectation that Russia has both done and probably has been successful in that same area. But then there's also the really interesting area of just broader, apparently criminal hacking by organized crime groups. These disruptive attacks, including against Asahi, Kadokawa, and various others. Now, is that state-ordered, state-tolerated? We can't know for certain, but it would seem to be that it certainly aligns with the interests of the Russian government. Russia regards Japan as an unfriendly state. So, if there are actors who are causing damage to the Russian economy, and are perhaps making some Japanese think, well, do we really want to get involved with this? It's causing us trouble. Wouldn't it be so much easier just to, distance ourselves from the whole Ukraine-Russia issue? So it's hard to say for certain, but it's a certain logic to the Russian government encouraging, or at least not stopping, those cyber attacks against Japanese companies. On the information side of things, that takes us to the upper house election last year. And for the book, I interviewed some experts on information issues, people who really looked on a lot of detail about the manipulation of social media, about the huge surge in support for Sanseito ahead of the election. And their view was they regarded it as very suspicious. Their view was that similar to the way in which the Russian state has used bots and trolls in order to boost parties that they favor, and also just to destabilize by promoting very divisive issues such as immigration. Their view was there were indications that that activity had been going on before the upper house election. Now, obviously, there's another election just around the corner. So it'd be very interesting to see if there's anything similar to that. If Japan, in the very short period between the upper house election and the current one, has been able to take any action to try and at least monitor, if not to crack down on some of those manipulation operations. Thank you.
Certainly, China may be trying with, given Takeichi's comments on Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. I think we've got about 5 minutes left, so possibly the last question.
Thank you, James. Dimitri Rakin here. I'm an independent consultant. So the book has been around for a few months. Have you seen any interest? And especially, of course, it's in English, but overall in Japan, right? How popular has it been here? Any interest from maybe not as much general public, but at least either academia or expert community, people who are interested in these topics, as you were, outlining sort of even kind of recommendations, right? Did that, resonate with people in Japan, with maybe with the government or someone? And do you think that there is a chance that the book will be translated in Japanese? Because I think that, that would be a huge success.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So, in terms of interest from academics, from the government, no, not really so much. I mean, a few of my sort of contacts kindly wrote sort of blurbs for it, sort of supported it in that way. But I think because it is primarily a historic book, less so in that regard. And it might well be with the second one that there is more interest, including from policy circles. When it comes to Japanese publishers, I would love to be able to approach them myself. But the problem is that in the contract with my British publisher, the arrangement is I don't approach a Japanese publisher. They have to do it. I have to say, I don't think they've been that active in doing that. So I'm hopeful that it might well be that a Japanese publisher would get in contact with them. Obviously, it would have to be translated, and it is a relatively long book. That turning a book of this length into a Japanese volume, it would probably end up being more than one kind of book. So that might be a bit of an obstacle. But I'm certainly hopeful, especially for the second one, given that it's not just historic, but also includes a lot of up-to-date things. But yeah, if you know some publishers that you'd like to mention it to, that would be most welcome. Thank you.
Okay, we can sneak in one last question. Lots of things to ask James.
There's one here.
Oh yes, great, thank you.
Everybody's tall. Mike King, retired. I grew up here, and we always had Soviet friends. And in those days, I think there was covert, overt, and a friend of mine was the son of the editor-in-chief for Pravda. And we always said he's the son of a spy. Of course, he never admitted to it, and I don't know if it's true, but is there still a lot of overt, covert spying?
Yeah, thank you very much. So on the point about journalists, well, it's great cover, isn't it? Because if you're a journalist, you have a justification for being in the country, you have a justification for asking lots of questions, making lots of contacts. So it's a great cover to have. And certainly during the Soviet period, it was widely used. And so Levchenko, who was mentioned, his cover was as a journalist. There was another who I didn't speak about, Preobrazhensky. His cover, he also defected, was a journalist. So as to the case today, I don't know, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if that will continue to be used. As to the sort of covert, kind of overt thing, yeah, I mean, I think that still exists, and the most clear divide between that is the legal and the so-called illegal spies. So the legal ones, again, someone whose cover is as a diplomat or someone working for state media, and then the illegals seemingly with no connection. So I mentioned the example of Yevgeny Kim. I don't know of any more recent cases of Russian illegals within Japan. The whole point is you can't identify them. But we do know of several cases elsewhere. The remarkable case of the couple in Slovenia who were posing as a couple from Argentina and were actually Russian undercover illegal spies. They had 2 children. Their children had no idea that their parents were Russian, knew the Russian language. They thought their parents were just from Argentina. What a shock that must be to you, to suddenly realize that your parents are from a different nationality and are spies. So my point being, if they're doing that in Europe, why wouldn't they do that in Japan as well? It is, from their point of view, an absolutely legitimate target. A country that is a close US ally, that plays host to US bases that Russia fears that in a conflict would be used against them. So from their point of view, not only do they see it as legitimate, they see it as an absolute sort of necessity to have good intelligence assets here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It sounded very much like the American drama show, The Americans. Yep.
Yeah.
Where the children grow up and find out their parents are Russian spies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to have to bring this to a close now, unfortunately. First of all, I'd like to give James a 1-year honorary membership.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we get kicked out quite soon, so thank you all for coming today. And thank you, James. That was a really, really interesting speech.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.